In this video, I'll break down some rehab principles and I'll explain you why it's wrong to stop training when you have an injury. I'll be using my own example because after I took a long break from squatting, when I returned, I started to have a hip impingement, so I'll be using that as a case study in a way. In very simple terms, when dealing with an injury, there are two things we need to do. On one hand, we need to let the angry tissue settle down, and on the other hand, we have to make it more resilient. To quote a classic, calm shit down, build shit up. Try to think about it as a callus. If you wear gloves and you avoid lifting anything with your hands are going to be very smooth and sensitive. But if on the other hand, your hands are smooth and you're doing too much, you're going to rip your hands and you're going to be sensitive for a few days. So in order to make them more resilient, you have to build that callus gradually. Now, I would also call that callus probably a capacity. And what I mean by that is the ability of the tissue to deal with stress. For some people, that stress can be running 10 miles. For me, the stress of avoiding the hip pain is squatting over 90 kilos probably, and so on. So this capacity is different from different structures, but also for different movements. Now, these principles are important to understand because at the end of the day, an injury is nothing more than applied force greater than the tissue tolerance. So if the force is greater than tissue tolerance, something is going to happen. Your body is going to react in a way. Most of the times, the result is an injury. It can be either changes in the structures, like a tendinopathy, or it can be something like a fracture. If you have a fall on your hand and the force you apply is greater than the tolerance of the bone, it's going to break. Simple as that.
Whee! I think I broke my arm. I definitely broke my arm.
But how do we build capacity and tissue tolerance when the area is very sensitive and we can't train it? Well, it's all about fine-tuning the parameters of your programming and the exercises. And what I mean by that is finding ways to work around your injury. In my instance, I had pain in the bottom of the squat if I would squat heavy. So if I would do a body squat, I would be fine. But then if I would put any weight on my back, I would start to have pain. So for me, it was the weight and also was the depth of the squat. Now, for some people might be running over 5 kilometers or 5 miles and so on. So it depends from one person to another. Actually, let me explain that properly because my approach is super simple. Let me draw that for you. In my example, we have a line that goes from heavy to light. So this first line is the load. And down here we have light. Now we also have a line which is a depth, which goes from shallow to deep. Now my goal for that is to get from here where I can do a shallow light squat to here where I can do a heavy deep squat, right? So the way I approach this is very simple. I basically start from down here, which is basically where I'm comfortable. So using a lightweight and shallow movement. So this is basically my warm-up. Now, in this case, there are a couple of things I tend to do. I always warm up doing some mobility drills. Now, the point of these mobility drills is to get me into a squat position a bit easier. The idea is to make it a bit easier, but don't take fucking ages to be able to get into one position. If you're warming up for an hour to lift weights for 40 minutes, that sucks. That's not the point of it. That's why I choose carefully the exercises. Some of the things I tend to do are for adductors. I'm trying to do a couple of frog stretches and including the version with the leg out. And I really love this one because it really warms up my adductors. The second thing I do, and it's one of my favorite exercises, are the side lunges but ass to the grass. And these are the two of the exercises I do before every single session of squatting. The next thing I do is a 90-90 drill. I love this one because it just warms up the mobility in the rotation in my hips. The other thing I enjoy doing are the lunges, but focusing on the hip extension. It's very important to be able to control the movement. Now, there is one thing I haven't mentioned in this first part, and that's the activation exercises. The reason I'm talking about it is because it's probably one of the most recommended exercise types when it comes to hip impingement. I consider I don't need that at this moment in time, and I'm not against them, but there is a whole discussion around it, which might be a good subject for the next video. We are going closer to lifting heavier and doing other things. So basically, we have two things we can do. One of them is to lift pretty heavy in this bit, but with shallow movements. In the gym, I tend to use the safe bars on the side, and I will see how far I feel comfortable to lift that weight. And I tend to go pretty heavy or try to do a bit of volume there. So I'm training in this area quite a bit. This corner, it's safe for me to work. So this, it's something that I'm quite happy to do. This is some love. On the other hand, we have another corner where we have some love. What I tend to do here is full depth squats, but fairly light. I'm basically training into these two bits and probably everything in between really. And the goal would be to get up here, so lift everything up here. Because we talked about capacity, this is something what you can see here, is that at this moment in time, this is where my capacity is. I can't go too heavy, so I can't get any closer to my 1 rep max, because as I go heavier, the depth is going to increase as well. So I have to limit myself somewhere probably around here. And this is quite interesting because my pain at this moment in time is here. So I'm just trying to push up this limit. This is why I'm saying it's important to work around the injury, but be smart about it. Let's dive deeper into this thing and why I believe it's important to train and work around your injury. Because what the rest basically means is training around here. So pretty shallow things and you're doing them light. So this means that you're doing something like a sit to stand. So sitting on the chair and getting up. That's nothing. Here would not be enough tissue stimulus to push this barrier up. So this area, I would say that this would probably be some of the homeostasis part, because these are day-to-day activities. But as you can see, if before the injury you've been here, now if you only stay here, it's gonna be impossible to get up to your goal. So what we have to do, we need to build up that callus and resilience. But if your limit is just here and you're pushing to the maximal bit, you will soon notice that your hip becomes too sensitive, so you have to back off a bit. I know it's difficult, this is not an exact science, and you will have good and bad days, so it's gonna be impossible to find that right balance every single time. And sometimes you're doing something above your limit, and what you do, you're gonna have to step back. Your hip or your joint might be sore for a couple of days, but at least you know how to work around it. I believe that this model applies to any injury. And that's why it's so important not to rest and just stay in this position, because you'll never get the chance to build up that callus. Try to think that when you started to go to the gym or to run or whatever it's your sport and your movement, it took a while to build up to where you've been before the injury. So the injury just brought you back a bit. Now you have to build it up again. And I think that's quite important to remember. You can't be fixed. Someone can just do something and you're magically fixed. It takes time and you have to work around it. And it's gonna be frustrating sometimes, and other times you're gonna feel amazing and you're gonna push too hard. It's always up and down. Anyway, to end up with my workout and my approach to my injury. After I'm doing the squats and I work around this, I tend to do a couple of lunges. And the reason for that is to build up a bit of strength in the legs and make sure I'm staying quite strong, even though I can't lift heavy in the bottom of the squat. Another thing I tend to do at the end of the workout is some stretching exercises. The reason for that is because when we have some pain, all that area becomes quite sensitive and tightens up. That's a normal reaction of our brain to protect us. So tightening up of any parts of our body is normal. What I tend to do a couple of pigeon stretching. It's basically just going to an external rotation of my hip into flexion, because that's a position that's sensitive for me. And another thing I choose to do quite regularly is a bit of hip flexion stretching. And I tend to do that on the wall. It's quite simple and very easy to do. I tend to do it quite dynamically, so I'm just shifting forwards and backwards, focusing on stretching and getting the hip into more extension. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a couple of things along the way. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any of them. And if there are any other subjects you'd like me to discuss, let me know and I will try to take that into consideration. See you in the next one.